Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at @theimprintnews. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of the other great Safe Camp Audio podcasts at safecampaudio.org, on the web at Safe Camp Audio, on all social media. On this week's episode, we are joined by Alex Piquero, a criminologist and professor at the University of Miami, to talk about what is and is not happening with youth crime in America. We talked about the main sources of data on this topic and the serious limitations we have when it comes to tracking, what the best numbers available say about trends with youth and crime, and he shared his views on how the media and politicians factor into the discussion, especially in a presidential election year. Piquero recently spent time leading the Bureau of Justice Statistics for the Biden administration, and we also got to discussing a bit about what he thinks the feds should be more focused on when it comes to criminal justice. And he also shared his thoughts on what we most definitively know works in terms of preventing youth from committing crimes or deterring them from doing it again. The context around this conversation is that in the past year, 2 state legislatures have passed significant juvenile justice bills. In Louisiana, where legislators had previously raised the age of the juvenile system to include 17-year-olds, Governor Jeff Landry just signed reforms that include a reversal of that and several other provisions that, quote unquote, get tougher on youth who commit crimes. And in Maryland, there's a bill which, as I'm recording this, has yet to be signed or vetoed by Governor Wes Moore, that would, among other things, expand the jurisdiction of the court over kids between 10 and 13 who are alleged to have committed crimes. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Alex Piquero. All right, we are joined today by well-known criminologist, University of Miami professor, former director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, all-around great Twitter follow, Alex Piquero. Talk about the current moment on youth crime when it comes to, I guess we'll put this into 3 entities: the media, the legislators and policymakers, and the data. So Alex, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
I'm glad to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into all that serious stuff, got to get rules of the road here on the Imprint Weekly Podcast. Got to give them at least one favorite. I'll give you the categories. Give me at least one. You can do all 5 if you want. Favorite TV show or movie, sports team, musical group, or book. Alex Piquero, what do you got for the folks?
I'll answer all of them.
Oh, here we go. Let's do it.
Fletch.
What an amazing start. Keep going.
If I have to pick one sports team, Dallas Cowboys.
Okay.
If I have to pick one band, Kiss, because that was my first concert in 1979, and I've had dinner with Gene Simmons.
Amazing.
And favorite book? I can't say one of my own. No, I'm just kidding.
You can. You will be judged for it, though.
I'm partial to The Splendid and the Vile. It's a book that came out about a year and a half ago about Churchill during the time of the Nazi invasion.
Very good. You didn't do TV. Do you want to go for the full 5?
Sure. TV. Oh, that's a no-brainer. Seinfeld.
Good call. All right. So I think you're the first one to do all 5. Congrats on that. So let's start this conversation in your backyard with the data and the research. I was recently at a convening where Alex did a great breakdown of, what the current numbers have to say about youth and crime. So let's start here before we get into that. Can you explain to listeners what the best source is for that type of stuff? What data do we have and where does it come from?
Yeah, we have to start with first principles of that a lot of crime never gets detected. And a lot of crime that does get detected never faces the position of an arrest or a conviction or something like that, especially for more minor offenses. Police and especially criminal justice personnel are more apt to give youth a break. So that aside, the 2 main sources of information are the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, which provides data on victimization experiences of individuals 12 and older, but it also asks victims of perceptions of the offender, their demographics. So that's one source of information. The second source of information is the arrest data that is compiled by the 18,000 some odd law enforcement agencies and then submitted to the FBI. And those are crimes, incidents, and arrests. So it has to get the bar that it has to be officially recorded in a police contact piece of paper or data file. They both are designed to measure the same thing, but go about it in different kinds of ways. But both have their strengths and both have their disadvantages because of the way the populations are sampled. And in the victimization survey, it's only a couple 100,000 people nationally represented. And the police data, you don't always have all the law enforcement agencies reporting to the FBI. And of course, you have a lot of discretion that police officers have at the local level. So those are the two main sources of data collection where we can actually look at the trends in juvenile crime.
And that victimization survey, while extremely important for a lot of reasons, that aspect that you described, it really is pretty, I don't want to say unscientific, but you're asking somebody what their perception of the age of a person that transgressed on them is, right?
Yeah, that's a fair point, John. I think it's designed more to track victimization trends, but it just so happens to also ask information about the aggressor or the offender's demographics, if the individual can recall those.
Sure.
But one of the advantages is that the NCBS also talks about whether or not the victim reported the event to the police. So think about a scenario where someone in the NCBS is 14 years old, is victimized by someone who's 14 years old, an ag assault, but then says, I didn't report it, right? So that's the nice check that the NCBS has on the official records.
Yeah, very good point. I didn't think about that. So you were kind enough for this convening that I was at to just kind of put some custom stuff together and really get at what they were trying to talk about this convening, which is like, what's going on with youth crime? I'll just let you kind of riff here. What did you put together and what did that, data show?
Well, I'll start with the punchline.
Sure.
There is no juvenile crime wave, period. And what I did is I used both the FBI's data, which the transition from the old summary reporting system to NIBRS. And then I also used the BJS National Crime Victimization Survey. And then I also added an additional analysis using the FBI's supplemental homicide reports, which has more fine-grained detail on victim and offender characteristics.
Okay.
And what I found was, do juveniles commit crime? Yes, juveniles commit crime. Are they committing crime at higher rates than people who are in their 19, 20, 24, 25, 35? The answer is absolutely not. And their rates of juvenile offending, if you look at the official arrest data, are as low as they were pre-pandemic. So the crime spike that we saw during COVID was not, and the crime that occurred after the social unrest that followed George Floyd's killing and into 2021 was not a juvenile crime problem. So the data, whether you look at victimization data, whether you look at offending data, whether you look at violent crime, total crime, homicide, juvenile offenders are not offending at rates higher than people who are older than they are. Period. Exclamation point, exclamation point.
So it's really two things. It's that they are not committing crimes at a rate higher than their older contemporaries. But then am I hearing you correctly that they are also not committing crimes within their own age demographic at a rate that's different than we saw them before the pandemic or really at any point?
That is exactly correct. From the data that are available, looking at broad categories, they are not doing anything demonstrably anywhere approaching what people in the 20s are doing with respect to total crime, violent crime, as well as victimization at all.
So then you noted that the sole exception as far as youth crime in any way spiking, when you were talking to us, was not necessarily a national trend, but that there were some pretty clear instances where there was a very large increase in the number of auto thefts or auto-related crimes.
Yeah, that's correct. So motor vehicle theft is one crime that started to spike at the outset of the pandemic and has sustained those increases in many cities in the United States. And that tends to be more of a youth crime that's comprised of people who are just doing joyriding, but it's a motor vehicle theft, as well as people who are stealing cars and selling them whole or stripping them down and stealing their parts. A subset of that is carjacking. The problem with carjacking is that at the national level, we have no good national level estimate because the majority of police departments don't report that separate offense to the FBI. So then that forces you to rely on local law enforcement agencies who have a public-facing dashboard, who not only provide carjacking data, but also break down by the demographics of the individual. And what we saw, DC has one of the best open portal crime data systems in the United States. What you see is in DC, it was a real big spike in the juveniles who were committing carjacking in the last couple of years, but those trends have started to abate, not just for juveniles, but also for adults in Washington, D.C. So it's always like the Barry Bonds number. There's an asterisk next to that because it's just hard to say how do you compare that to, the non-Barry Bonds era of baseball.
So it's like an interesting signal to you that the place that does happen to do the best tracking has this. It's like, okay, that means it could be happening elsewhere, but it's not necessarily, it's not probably good due diligence to just assume that that's the case either.
Yeah, that's correct. But it kind of like raises your question. Let me see what other cities look like. Should they have the data at that level of granular detail? But unfortunately, the majority of them do not.
I mean, one nice thing about you is that you're obviously an expert on the data and extracting it and all that stuff. But you're, like I said, you're a good Twitter follower because you follow the conversation. You're in a lot of conversations. Yeah. How do you feel about auto theft and youth? Because it does seem to me like that's what we often talk about. And the narrative around fear and youth and crime is really defined by violence. We're afraid of kids killing other people or afraid of them committing violence. And auto theft is not that, but it's like if you get your car stolen and you're making, $30,000 a year, that's a really painful thing to experience. And I wonder sometimes if, advocates who are rightfully pushing back and trying to champion youth don't account for just like how the public receives that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and we're in a world now where people self-select the information they read. When I was a kid, there were 3 major networks and the newspapers, and I still watch the 3 major networks and read the newspaper. But the majority of people don't do that. I asked a couple of my students last week, I said, where do you get your information from? And someone literally said TikTok. And I thought, well, okay, probably not the best source of news, but whatever. And so when people turn on the local news, they're going to hear whether there were 3 kids shot last night, whether 4 cars were stolen and they were joyriding. And that's the narrative that people hear.
Yeah.
But that's certainly a small fraction of the overall crime issue and crime problem. And that's where we have a real big disconnect between what the data and the research show and what people perceive the status of affairs with respect to crime is. When they see kids, smashing and grabbing into a jewelry store, when they see kids, carjacking some elderly person, they're going to say, oh my gosh, this place is out of control. But that's not the norm. It's just not the norm, and not just those crime types, but the demographics of those individuals committing crime, for sure.
Yeah, and I don't think it's like, I don't know if it's possible to quantify just the extent to which, if you add social media to what you're thinking of as media, what that does to everything. I don't think you were there for this part, but there was somebody that shared, the observation that, and it was another person in the news industry. They were talking to somebody that worked for kind of a local news affiliate who basically said, like, I get offered enough content of just people on video killing somebody else or shooting somebody or doing something. It could literally be the entire newscast. And that's a fundamentally modern problem. You're right. That was not an issue when it was just
That's exactly right.
News networks.
That is exactly right. And a lot of the content when I travel over the country, I always try to put on the local news from wherever I am just to watch it for a half hour. And it's exactly that. It's cell phone video of people doing crazy stuff. And so people are digesting that over and over and over again. There's a very famous sociologist once said, if you perceive a situation as real, it's real in its consequences. And so if you believe that this is what's happening, you're going to then follow suit everything else that there, would come policy-wise thereafter.
While I was sort of digesting your presentation at convening, I'll just share, and I want your reaction to this. Like, I was sitting there like, this is probably, we just got a presentation from the guy most capable of generating this information. It's not easy to do. It's not easy for just an average person to go pull this together, even if they're like an advocate or a lawyer or whatever. And it's 2 years out of date. That's not your fault. That's just the reality of the situation. Yeah. I'm like, God, that's a real uphill battle if you're going to rely on numbers to make your case locally, because you're just giving a top line thing. That's easy to push back on if you want to do it. Say like, that's not our story. Well, I just saw on the news that this kid did this or that.
It is incredibly frustrating, the status of crime data in the United States. At the national level, we are at least almost 1 year away from knowing what happened in the past year because the FBI doesn't release their data until the fall that a particular year for the prior year. So if I'm a policymaker at the national level or in the state level, doesn't help me at all. So that forces people to do one of two things: to look at the quarterly data that the FBI releases. Again, that's outdated, but and it's only a fraction of the agencies.
Yeah.
And or go to your local law enforcement agency, whether it's county or city or whatever it is you're looking at, and hope that they're updating. First of all, hope that they're producing that on the dashboard. Hope that they're updating it pretty regularly. And so that's, to me, not satisfying. I mean, I've said this so many times, John. Like I can get on a website right now and see where every plane is in the United States airspace. I can tell you what time it took off, what time it's going to land. I can tell you its altitude. I can tell you all of these characteristics right now about airspace in America, but I can't tell you anything remotely near that on crime.
You know, that's a good one. I actually think I'm thinking on the fly. Give me some space here, but 3 things that are going to really partially decide this upcoming presidential election: the economy, the border, and crime. Those are 3. There's certainly other ones. Okay. This country, people in this country would go crazy if we had even a 6-month lag on knowing about jobs or inflation or anything like that. And we know in real time, all of a sudden, I think this has gotten better in terms of just like data quality. Like it seems like now we just know real time, like how many people are getting apprehended at the border or seeking asylum or stuff like that. And yet this other thing that's just like this enormous issue, and somehow it's like, okay, that we get it 2 years behind. The way that you said it with the FBI makes me think that they could do it earlier. Is that the case? Do you feel like they're too precious about holding it for whatever?
I think there are three headwinds here. The first one is the FBI was put in charge of data collection in the 1930s because J. Edgar Hoover convinced lawmakers that it should be housed in the FBI. So the FBI is an enforcement agency.
Yeah.
So problem one. Okay. Problem two is that the federal government cannot mandatorily require cities and agencies to report crime data. States can. And Tennessee is an example where they require every law enforcement agency to report crime data to the state, and then the state reports to the FBI. But the federal government cannot make a non-federal entity mandatorily report crime data. So that's another problem. And the third problem is there's record checks that happen. It takes a lot of time. Not every agency provides data on time. There's errors, and there's constantly back and forth going on. So you want whatever numbers you end up producing, you want them to be accurate and reliable. You want them also to be timely. And so those 3 words are actually, ironically enough, what is in the charter for the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the federal statistical agency in charge of crime and justice data. So I think that those are the reasons why we don't have at the national level the data we need. You know, if I want to wait a year for data and I just want to be a criminologist, write a bunch of articles, fine. That's all. Doesn't matter to me when data come out. But here I am in April, and I can't tell you the total number of homicides in 2023 in the United States. I can't tell you. That mean to me is just not acceptable. It's just not acceptable.
That's wild. Let me ask you one more data researchy question, and we can talk a little media and stuff. But you alluded to this before, but just when you're talking about like overall arrests, that kind of just becomes a de facto marker a little bit for like youth crime behavior, because we obviously don't know everything that kids did that nobody reported and they didn't confess.
Correct.
So, you know, what we know is that like that number just plummeted from the 1990s. It was in the 600,000 range, I think, before the pandemic. And then it like really fell off in 2020. I don't know if I've ever seen the 2021 report. You probably have, but I'm guessing it sounds like you're saying that 2021 shows kind of back to 2019, right? Like back to that.
We are much safer now than we were in the beginning of the 1990s. There's just, no doubt about it. And we were at really low levels in 2019. In 2020 and 2021, we saw certain crime types increase in most of our major cities in the United States. By the way, it didn't happen around the world. Just an interesting side note there. And then it started to kind of come back down in 2022. And in the preliminary data I've seen and been tracking for calendar year 23, we're going to be lower than 22. And for some crime types, we'll be right where we were at the beginning of the pandemic.
Got it. So my question on just that overarching historical trend there is, you know, obviously the biggest driver of that is probably just kids are committing less crime. You know, that's the like Against razor, but
that's correct. But we also likely have fewer kids in the age crime prone groups, where there might be just having more numbers of kids around.
Sure. And then I also, it kind of seems logical that in an era where there has been much juvenile justice reform, there are more police diverting before arrest, or there are in some cases, police observing crime and not arresting, right? Like we've read about that. So there's lots of reasons. I guess my question to you is like, are you aware of anybody that has actually attempted to suss this out? Or do we have any information on sort of, the makeup of the crime, of the arrest drop?
You raise a really great point about police encountering a juvenile and deciding whether or not to arrest an individual or to do something else. Most police departments do not track contacts that don't result in something else. They capture calls for service, but then they capture only an arrest. So if a local law enforcement officer in Miami meets a juvenile at night, busts the kid for doing something, but doesn't write the kid up and says, get out of here, I don't want to see you again, or otherwise I'm going to bust you, that contact isn't necessarily written down and coded. So to answer your question, we would need a coding sheet for every single contact an officer made, and then a coding sheet for when officers decided not to arrest someone when they could have arrested someone. That will then give you a much better glimpse of the true incidence of how much of a behavior is out there that could be subject to criminal justice processing.
Hey, y'all, I'm Sequoia Jones.
And I'm Elliot Hinkle.
And we're the host of the new podcast, Community Insight.
Our show is all about the growing movement to invest in the well-being of families.
We know our systems have fallen short of valuing and investing in families.
It's one thing to recognize that too many children are being separated from families and placed in foster care. It's another thing to take action.
But what does that look like?
The Community Insight podcast is going to bring you to the forefront of the family well-being movement, spotlighting the Thriving Families Safer Children initiative and beyond.
We're going to hear from the people working in communities and at the national level as they create new partnerships,
communities and systems together,
and address the root cause issues facing so many families. Deep insights have always existed within communities. It's time to bring these insights outside so you can check them out and bring what works into your community.
New episodes will publish every other week starting April 2024.
Follow us now wherever you get your podcast.
This project was funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. We thank them for their support and acknowledge that the opinions and conclusions presented in the podcast are those of its subjects and the host alone, and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the foundation.
All right, so let's talk a little media and politics, and I say do it in tandem because, let's start there with you. But it seems to me like you can't really parse these out. It's kind of chicken and egg when it comes to crime. Like the media spurs political response, political speech yields media coverage because you have to cover it on some level. So it's pretty hard to aggregate, I would think, or disaggregate, right?
Yeah, I've lived in that world for quite a few years in the sense of how the media covers crime, how policymakers digest information that's produced in the media, and whether or not they pay attention to it. I'll give you a good example. In Maryland, lawmakers about 2 weeks ago passed a juvenile justice, we call it a reform bill, that actually makes things worse. Potentially, it kind of undoes some of the gains that the state of Maryland had. And now it's up to Governor Westmore to decide whether or not to sign it or to veto it. Now, obviously, the governor has a bridge to deal with and obviously lots of other things. So my colleague, Heather Warnke and I, she's at the University of Baltimore Law School, we wrote an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun last week that basically said, that led with the data. Look, there is no juvenile crime wave in Maryland. Some of these potential reforms are actually going to make the problem worse, and they're going to make them worse for minority kids. And here are the things that you can salvage from these bills that are actually good, and the rest is just bad. So we urge, hey, veto the bill. Now, whether or not the governor cares about the opinions of two people, who knows? But at least we got out there leading with the data that says this is what the data show. And if lawmakers are going to say we have a juvenile crime wave, then my response will be, well, the onus is on you to demonstrate that we have one, because the data I see don't demonstrate that. And in fact, we actually cited and linked to John, in our op-ed, data from Maryland's own juvenile justice agency showing lower crime rate trends in the state of Maryland, not higher.
Yeah. What in your mind is the anatomy of the typical, bad media coverage of youth crime? Because I imagine, so you just gave an example of an op-ed where you're pushing back on legislation. I wouldn't necessarily consider an op-ed that argued for tougher things to necessarily innately be bad. If it was, I think it would be a problem if they let them do that, citing a crime wave without evidence, right? That's bad. That's bad editing.
Yeah.
But I guess I have an idea in my head of what it typically looks like. I'm curious, or you consume much more than me. So, what does it usually look like when the media does a bad job covering or presenting youth?
Well, there are two of them. One I saw about 6 months ago, and one I saw in the last few days. The 6 months ago was carjacking, quote, carjacking, the latest crime wave in America. That's false. I mean, or at least I don't know. Another one was hate crime is up in America. Maybe, maybe not. The reason why is because most police departments don't report hate crime. Second, hate crime is defined differently in every statute. Third, 50% of hate crimes are never reported. So they're up from some number that I have no idea what the number was beforehand because I don't know what went into it. So Could it be up? Yeah. Could it be down? Yeah. Whatever it is, I don't know what it is. Whatever number it is, it's too much. That's what I said to debunk those kinds of arguments. Another one is about racial profiling, disproportionate stops of motorists. And the biggest problem with studying this issue, because I've written on it and talked about it in so many ways, is we don't know what the denominator is. So if I stop a certain number of people, it's out of what? It can't be out of everybody in the population of a certain demographic group, because not everybody can drive a car. Are certain demographic groups driving certain ways? I don't know the answer to that. How are you capturing race and ethnicity of the driver? I don't know how you're doing that. In Florida, it's not on our IDs. So is the officer self-perceiving the race and ethnicity and writing it down? Or are they asking the motorist? And what happens if the motorist says, I'm not telling you? So everything to study racial profiling, as an example, comes precisely to how you code and capture the data. And there's no standardized way of people coding and capturing the data. So this is why data, as maybe unsexy it is to some people, is foundational to doing anything with respect to informing policy, guiding policy, changing policy one way or the other. So I think those three are good examples of the lead is not necessarily based on the appropriate data. Could the lead be right? Yeah, the lead could be right. It's not the lead I'd use, but I also get that side of the world.
And also, it feels to me like there's I call this an insidious problem, but a more frequent one is you're identifying, right, these trend stories that sort of set the premise, this is a trend, and you're 10 paragraphs in being where's the numbers that support this being a trend?
Correct.
To me, it just feels like there's a very high, for every one of those, there's just 10 articles that cover a singular event that involves young people. And I could, as a reporter, just kind of knowing the media, I just know it was probably the case that somebody had that, they caught it on a scanner, or they just found out I'll cover this, and you have half an hour and you got to do 5 stories in a week, and it's one source, this country's going to shit.
Yep.
And boom, and it's no time for nuanced data or anything, even if it did exist,
I couldn't agree with you more on that. Now, I've worked with reporters in so many different markets at local levels, national levels, international levels. And there's a lot of variation for exactly those reasons. They're on a 2-minute deadline, and they have to pump 1,000 of them out because newsrooms are being cut, left and right.
Yeah.
But for every one of those, then there are great reporters. There's a team at the San Francisco Chronicle who spent 9 months on a story of police crashes and coding deaths. And there's no national data collection. So I worked with them, and they literally poured into the data, and they fact checked, and they sourced, and they took their time, and the quality of the work was fantastic. And so there are realistic pressures I get that journalism and newsrooms have these days. But, there are no shortcuts in life. And because people words matter, and people pay attention to words. So there's got to be some sort of happy medium here where editors are saying, okay, fact check, We can run it tomorrow. It's online. We can update it in an hour. So I think that's a realistic concern the media has. But the average consumer of media doesn't understand these nuances and details. They just don't, because they're looking at their phone and they're just looking at here's my 5 top news stories, and I just keep scrolling. They're not and people are not digesting the stories the way they need to digest the stories and to unpack that. Yeah,
it's tough. I don't know the solution to that. I really don't, because it is the pressure, the time pressure for content is so, it's like a hard thing to grapple with in the whole scheme of this discussion. I just don't think people, You mentioned Maryland passing, has the legislators passed as of when we're talking? Governor Moore has not done anything yet. I'll update before this interview, one way or another, if he takes an action. Louisiana is another state that has rolled back. They've actually, I think, they're the first state in decades to lower the age. We've been raising the age in a lot of states of juvenile jurisdiction. So, I hate to ask a data guy how they feel vibes wise, but do you feel like we're on the precipice of this being a get tough era, or do you feel like right now these are pretty isolated instances with these two states?
One's isolated, 2 is 3 could be something different. What surprises me about Maryland is it's a Democratic state. It's not like a conservative Democratic state. And so that one worries me a lot. The governor, and I'm not digging the governor, but the governor says I'm a data-driven, evidence-based guy. The onus is on you to follow the data. But the thing, John, with these current bills and these movements in legislatures is, if they're responding to something that's real, let's measure the response. But it hasn't been broken, and so why are we creating a solution in search of a problem? That's what worries me. Is Louisiana, then Maryland, who's next? And I worry about that, especially because the tone and tenor of the election coming up, public safety is going to be 100% part of this discussion. I'm not naive to understand the political world. So I get playing on people's fears and talking to your base and all those kinds of things. And I also understand that there's a lot of balls in the air that these individuals and their parties have to juggle. I get that too. I just wish we were in a world where you are not in one camp or the other. The nuance of anything has been gone in our world for the last 6-8 years. And everything, as you know, on social and policy issues is nuanced. It's not always this or that, but that's what it's become, and that's fed down to people. Right. And people are, it's this or that. It's let's talk about where we might find points of agreement on. And if we find points of disagreement, we're never going to solve those. So let's just put those aside and let's figure out where we can find some sort of compromise. And compromise is, it's just kind of vanished, it seems. And I think we're going to have that same problem, I fear, one way or the other come this fall.
Yeah, and I'll include for listeners the op-ed that Dr. Piquero wrote. We had an op-ed recently that kind of focused on the Maryland legislation. It was interesting by a guy named Robin Campbell, who took issue. I had not really thought about this. He explored this kind of heavy presence of the word accountability in the narrative, including, Governor Moore mentioning it. And, he kind of took it to task as being like a slippery word. It's kind of vague. It's an eye of the beholder type of thing. What are your thoughts on that? What is the right way to explain in a public way the actual point of even having a juvenile justice system?
Accountability is important because if people are doing things that are illegal, and especially things that are harming other human beings, they should be held accountable to the extent that they should be punished accordingly. So one of my colleagues has always said, there are people we're mad at and people we're afraid of. Accountability looks 2 different ways to those sets of people. I can hold someone accountable that they just did something really stupid, but I can also hold someone accountable that we're really afraid of, that all of us are afraid of. And the accountability will look very different to those 2 people, right? So you can divert a kid, that's still holding them accountable because you can put, conditions to whatever diversion you put on them. And then you can also hold someone accountable for committing a real serious personal crime. So accountability just looks differently depending upon the context and the offense in question. So it's not that diversion gives kids a free pass. It's not that probation gives people a free pass. It's not that the thing is not everybody needs to be incarcerated, and not everybody needs to be incarcerated for very long periods of time. The key is identifying who those people are.
Yeah. This was not the writer's point, but it's actually kind of what I thought after reading it was like, we have a lot of people that use accountability because they don't want to say detain and incarcerate. They're using it to I don't want to have to say that, so I'm going to say hold accountable, which it kind of plays into what you're saying.
At some point, you have to explain what it means.
Yeah, or somebody has to ask. Right. All right, I'll get you out on this. I want to talk a little about actually another op-ed you wrote that really resonated with me on a wonkier subject than youth crime in Maryland, but this was about the federal budget and specifically President Biden's. Your former boss. So I'm just going to permit me to read just a couple of paragraphs, just quick from it, and then I'll ask you about it. But this is Alex's words. President Biden recently released his budget request to Congress. While I applaud its overall approach to public safety, focusing on things like community-based groups, supporting victims, addressing the gun violence epidemic, and police recruitment and training, much less attention and resources are devoted to building the evidence base for this infusion of resources. And this is my favorite part. The irony is that for decades, Congress has championed evidence-based policymaking, in many cases mandating that grant programs go to activities that demonstrate effectiveness, yet the necessary groundwork for such evidence lacks the financial backing it requires and deserved. So as I mentioned at the top, you had the chance to lead one of these agencies, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that, and in that effort federally, we talk about the collection of data on the federal level. This is about actually measuring what works and things like that. So coming away from your time there at BJS, inside the machine a little bit, what's the deal? Are they underfunded to do what you're describing? Are we focused on the wrong priorities with those agencies, with their activities, or what? Why are we not doing what you're describing in this op-ed?
They're woefully underfunded, and they have been woefully underfunded for at least a dozen years. Not just in terms of dollar amounts, but also staffing levels to do the kind of work that they need to do. So I'll give you the BJS as a good example.
Sure.
The budget's basically been flat forever, especially when you adjust for inflation and so forth. Compared to what it was in the early 2000s, it had many more dollars and many more people. And then slowly it's been gutted. Same thing for the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of the Department of Justice.
And maybe taking on more work too, correct? The Office of Juvenile Justice used to do research, and am I wrong about that, or did they hand off to BJS?
It's been handed off to other components in the department. And so here's what happens is, in BJS in particular, the National Crime Victimization Survey costs a lot of money. It takes a significant chunk out of BJS. So that means that BJS can't do every single data collection every single year. And that's magnified because then Congress comes in and says, in the next 60 or 90 days, we want you to study the effectiveness or collect data on X, Y, and Z. Well, that means I have to take someone off of one project and put them on another project. And Congress does this left and right. And I'm not saying that Congress shouldn't do that. Congress should be asking NIJ and BJS to do things. I want them to be asking NIJ and BJS to do things that are appropriate and within the scope of the organizations. But just asking people to do things for free, and then that you just don't have enough degrees of freedom to move around. So if you're not funding agencies the way they had been and should be, and you give them more work to do with less amount of resources and people, you're not going to be able to deliver the kinds of products the nation needs. And that's not a dig against the people who work in those agencies who are so committed to the work. We just don't have enough bodies to do the work.
So that's the problem, forward looking. What have we established, in fact, when it comes to effectively deterring youth from committing crime, either preventatively or after they've already done it? Like, what models or strategies or services? I mean, think big picture. Do you just feel in your bones like, why are we not? The numbers are in on this. We should be spending much more and investing much more in these things.
Oh, yeah. The number one thing, and I've done several meta-analyses, and for the listeners, a meta-analysis is a advanced research approach that actually synthesizes a number of studies on a particular program or intervention. So think about that as a simple synthesis and a single answer. Does this work? And if so, how good? So several of them that I've done have focused on early family parent training programs and self-control development programs. that are done in the first 5-10 years of life. That is the absolute number one thing we can do to prevent crime, is invest in family training programs to have kids develop effective self-control. It is the absolute number one thing we can do. We won't see the results tonight, but if you keep doing this now over and over again, you will see these results, because these studies have been done, John, in the United States, in cities and counties, for whites, for blacks, for males, for females, and around the world. Repeatedly, these things are the strongest thing we can do. That's a more medium to long-term effect. It costs money, but you'll save money in the long run. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but what about the right here, right now? The best approaches we know about the right here, right now are cognitive behavioral therapy programs that basically train kids to make better decisions in the moment that they're in. So instead of picking up a gun, what about if I do something else? Or instead of, doing this, what if I had other options? It's about getting kids to think about the long-term consequences of their actions and stop acting for the immediate right now. And the reason why that's so important is because the research in psychological decision-making and adolescent brain development in the last 20 years, and you heard about this at the convening, shows that kids' self-control or people's self-control is really developing much later than the reward processes of their brain. So this is not giving kids a free pass, but this is understanding how they go about making decisions. Right? We made decisions when we were 13 in a very different way than we make decisions when we're adults, because we grow up, the consequences are different. We understand the long-term implications of our behavior. So that is the kind of right now kind of stuff that you can do for kids, to think about decision-making. And these things just don't affect crime. They are all related to other kinds of life outcomes as well. Educational attainment, employment, interpersonal relationships. So crime is but one of the outcomes that getting this stuff out there to kids and parents for the more medium to longer term perspective. That's what we can do. Now, that doesn't mean the criminal justice system can't be effective. So you can't do crime prevention intervention without police, law enforcement as well. And so we know that some things that police do work very well. We know that hotspots policing, especially when done in a constitutionally and a procedurally just manner. Cops are very good at interrupting violent places. They're very good at tracking violent people. So we need the police to do those kinds of things. We need correctional facilities to have evidence-based programming. We know that several of those things exist. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be implemented in prisons, and it works. We know that educational programming that's put in prisons, my studies have shown in Florida, can work as well. So the key is resourcing and making those programs available with staff who are trained and compensated to carry out that work among people that a lot of society doesn't want or want to deal with. So that's, when we think about crime prevention, we think about crime intervention policies, we're thinking about non-policing strategies, we're thinking about policing strategies, we're thinking about short-term, medium-term, and long-term, so long as the resources, the staffing are there.
Alex Piquero, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Pleasure.
Thanks to criminologist and University of Miami professor Alex Piquero for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews. And you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org or email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.